Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. Thank you for joining us tonight virtually. My name is Chris Moriello, and I am the director of the center. As always, we begin our remembrance ceremony with the national anthem. In this unprecedented year of suffering and loss, let us reflect on the hundreds of thousands of our fellow Americans who died and the millions of others suffering around the world.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose rough stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
And now, Christopher Moriello, Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Salem State University.
Good evening. A year ago, I stood in this very same place to welcome you to our first virtual Yom HaShoah at the outset of a growing pandemic. At the time, I could not have anticipated the extraordinary and difficult year that was coming up. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Americans have died, and we have been separated too long from our family and friends. Hopefully, with the vaccine, we can return to some type of normal life. However, what could have been anticipated was the growing political divisions in America and the appearance of a uniquely American form of populism grounded in anger, misinformation, racism, and anti-democracy. On January 6, we watched a populist-inspired mob descend on the Capitol, attempting to overthrow democracy and undermine the rule of law. That these insurrectionists were wearing anti-Semitic slogans on their T-shirts and waving racist Confederate flags was not surprising. To those of us who study history, anti-Semitism, racism, and prejudice are the essence of far-right populism and neo-fascism. They are watchwords for their anti-democratic impulse. That was true in 1933, and it is true today. While January 6th was a sobering national spectacle, anti-Semitism, racism, and prejudice happens at the local, everyday level. I know many of us were appalled at the anti-Semitic incident surrounding the Duxbury football team and their coach. In 2020-21, I never thought I would hear the word Auschwitz used so carelessly and mockingly. Auschwitz was more than a camp. It has symbolic power, representing the experiences of victims and survivors of the Holocaust. It is anti-Semitism at the micro level, and it brings immense pain to all of us. As we reflect on the victims and survivors of the Holocaust tonight, let us do better, individually and collectively. If the young men who used Auschwitz carelessly on the football field knew the pain they were causing, shame on them. If they did not, shame on us. The Holocaust is a mirror that we hold up to our humanity. It is a benchmark of evil that we need to judge our moral progress. As late Holocaust survivor Sonia Schreiber-Weitz often said, it is not the past or present generations we need to connect with, but our young people and the next generation who will carry on the lessons of the Holocaust. So tonight, as we look back and remember, let us look forward to teach and to act. This year, we are once again pleased to have Rabbi David Meyer from Temple Emmanuel in Marblehead and Rabbi Richard Perlman from Temple Ner Tamid of the North Shore to lead us in reflections, prayers, and our candle lighting ceremony.
Prophet Isaiah called out his famous words, Shalom, shalom, la rachok v'la karov. Greetings of shalom to those both far and near. And on behalf of Temple Emmanuel, I also want to welcome everyone joining us remotely here this evening, those nearby and those from places far and wide. For although our sanctuary is nearly empty, it is nonetheless a special honor to once again be hosting tonight's observance of Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day of remembrance of the Holocaust and the heroism, of the destruction and the resiliency. Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day was established by the Israeli Knesset in 1951. And in fact, this observance and next week's Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers of Israel and victims of terrorism, are the only two memorial days of the State of Israel established by law. So tonight, let us consider that for Jews, memory is not merely an occasional practice. In fact, memory is an exercise of spiritual discipline. From of old, our sages have taught us the 6 remembrances, the episodes in our formative history, which should be recalled on a daily basis as a regular practice. And these include Yetziat Mitzrayim, the going out of Egypt, Ma'amad Har Sinai, standing at Sinai to receive the Torah, Maaseh Amalek, remembering the evil Amalekites who attacked the most vulnerable, Maaseh Egel HaZahav, remembering the failure of faith in the building of the golden calf, Maaseh Miriam, how Miriam spoke words of gossip and slander and was punished for her words, and Zechirat Shabbat, remembering the Sabbath day and elevating it as a day of rest, holiness, and joy. We are urged by our tradition to remember on a daily basis these episodes in our people's history, not simply for memory's sake alone, but to help refine our personal qualities and virtues. And so it is as we in the generation following the Holocaust add another remembrance to our sages' list. And like the 6 remembrances of our tradition, this 7th remembrance of the Holocaust and the heroism must always be part of our personal as well as national refinement. For remembrance, such as we will share tonight, not only brings honor to the lives of those lost in the Shoah, but also can help guide our moral direction today and into an unmeasured future. Through our remembering, let us learn anew and vow to never become a perpetrator, to never see oneself as a helpless victim, and above all, to never become a bystander to evil. So I want to thank those who have prepared and who will participate in this evening's program. I would now invite my colleague and friend, Rabbi Rick Perlman of Temple Ner Tamid in Peabody, to share his own reflections on this solemn occasion of remembrance.
Last year, I spoke of 2 children, 2 kids, who spray painted swastikas on my former synagogue in Rhode Island. Now, I'm not going to tell the story again. The lesson of that story, though, was the message to educate our youth, especially these young minds, of the horrors of the Shoah. Just the other day, as we recently heard at the beginning of this program, we were saddened to learn of the story that occurred in Duxbury, where the lack of Holocaust education perhaps showed itself. Kids and misguided adult coaches, perhaps, using audibles such as Auschwitz and Rabbi, Jew. And these words are not okay. Hate is not okay. Never, ever. Other words that we use against each other are not okay. But when I heard of this event that happened in Duxbury, I immediately realized that I needed to write to someone and let them know, don't cancel the games, educate. You cancel the games, kids are going to hate more. Certainly the adults that were involved in this, well, they need to be held accountable because they should know better. But kids, young minds, need to be educated. They have to know the truth of what happened to our people. They fire the coach? Yes. The adults should know better? Yes. Perhaps the school committee and the state committees dealing with education need to do a better job to educate and teach history, good or bad, but teach history. We must educate our children. The other day I was reading a story of a podcast of a person whose name I'd rather not mention. But he was telling his listeners, and he has many, about Easter and Passover. As a Christian, he described Easter correctly. His description of Passover, however, was quite a bit off. To him, Passover was about the angel of death that passed over the Egyptians while killing their firstborn. Now, while that observation is actually somewhat correct, it's completely missing the most important part. It's the part about why. Why? You see, there's nothing in these facts telling about the children of Israel who were slaves, who were persecuted, who were whipped and worked to death daily as slaves. He didn't tell that part of the Passover story. He didn't educate his listeners about the facts that these children of Israel had to be freed by God, the God who loves freedom, the God who loves his children. He didn't mention a word about the fact that God and Moses had to persuade the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, into letting our people go. Not just by 10 or the 10th plague, but by 10 plagues that it took to finally persuade this evil man to let our people go. And it's interesting because when we do celebrate Passover, that 10th cup of joy, we take 10 drops of joy from the cup so that we do not share the joy in that 10th plague. It never should have happened. It should never happen again. People should not be persecuted. Educators must educate. History must never be erased or torn down. For if we do not teach the next generation about mistakes and misdeeds of hate that existed and sadly still exists today, it exists due to xenophobia. So many people of different races, creeds, and colors are dealing with hate today. Let us learn from the Shoah. Let us teach each other to love one another. It must never happen again. It can never happen again. We must not deny. We must educate our children. Never again means never again. May the souls of those who were lost to hate, to persecution, may they rest in peace, knowing that we will always be here and we will always remember. At this time, my colleague and dear friend, Rabbi Meyer, will now light the candles to remember the memory of the 6 million of our brethren who were taken from us during the Shoah.
באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני מאמין. עם כל זה אני מאמין. אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני מאמין שאף על פי שהתממע עם כל זה אני מאמין.
Each year, we use the Yom HaShoah commemoration to celebrate all the participants for the Sonia Schreiber-White's Upstander Award. The award recognizes young people who stood up to anti-Semitism, racism, and prejudice in their schools and communities. As an educator, Sonia wanted to use her story and poetry to encourage the younger generation to stand up for what they believed in and for what was right and what was good. This year, due to COVID-19 restrictions and a remote school year, we could not have teachers nominate students for the award. In consultation with Sonia's children, Andy, Don, and Sandy, and Anna Mae McCoy, a teacher at the Pingree School, we are delighted to have two Pingree School students, Carter Segal, grade 12, and Lindsay Goldstein, grade 11, reflect on writings from the Holocaust and the meaning of Holocaust memory to their lives.
Never Shall I Forget by Eli Wiesel. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my face forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. As a Holocaust Legacy Fellow, I have heard the stories of several survivors, and each one has ended with the same message. It is our duty to carry their stories with us. As time goes on, there will be fewer and fewer survivors, and it will become even more important that we do not let their pain and struggles be forgotten. Besides the physical loss from the flames, our community lost the stories and culture of millions. We need to take the initiative to not just study the past, however, but to educate others about both the nature of anti-Semitism and its presence today. Recently, our community learned about the anti-Semitic play calls used by a local football team that reveals a lack of knowledge about the horrors of the Holocaust and a universal need for education. Wiesel watched the horrors of the Holocaust unfold under a silent sky. It is our duty as human beings to never allow that silence. We must tell the stories of the victims and the survivors, and we must never tolerate hatred.
My name is Lindsay Goldstein, and I am a junior at Pingree School. I will be reflecting on the poem, Never Shall I Forget. It is crucial to remember the Holocaust because of how scarring it was to so many people. As the author, Elie Wiesel, said in this poem, there were children's bodies, moments that, quote, murdered my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. That imagery is so raw and real, one can't help but listen. My own ancestors were impacted by the death and brutality of this time. It was the reason they emigrated to America. It is my responsibility to respect their lives by learning their stories and honoring their experiences. In doing so, we must also spread awareness about anti-Semitism that still occurs today. The Holocaust was only a short time ago, and anti-Semitism still prevails. It affects all young people today, and we must do what we can to work against it for the next generation. In continuing to learn about the Holocaust, we must do what is within our power to prevent tragedies like this from happening to anyone ever again. We cannot let flames consume the faith of Jews or of any other group. Wiesel vows to never forget, even if he lives as long as God himself. He sets an example, as we must do the same. We must remember, for us, the generations before us, and the generations to come.
The Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the North Shore benefit from the ongoing support and commitment of the institutional and political leaders in our community. Tonight, President of Salem State University, John Keenan, gives greetings from the university, and representative from the Massachusetts 6th District, Seth Moulton, provides us with a timely message.
Good evening. I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to everyone that has made this meaningful event possible. I would like to give a special thanks to the Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Jewish Community Center of North Shore for your ongoing support, and to Professor Christopher Moriello and Program Director Dan Hachette for their dedicated and outstanding leadership of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State. I would also like to extend a warm thank you to Congressman Seth Moulton for joining us for this important day of remembrance. As we remember the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, we must all consider the importance of fighting humanity's challenges in the best possible way. Salem State University and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies share a deep commitment to social justice and human rights. We are committed to the values of inclusivity, decency, and the dignity of all people. We must never forget the millions of lives lost in the Holocaust and must be resolute in our commitment to ending acts of violence against those who are considered different, outsiders, and targeted as scapegoats. We stand in solidarity with the Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the ongoing fight for racial equity and justice. We also stand in solidarity with members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community who have been unjustly attacked and blamed in wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the pandemic has made clear, the threat to humanity anywhere is everyone's problem. We must all act to protect those who are at the greatest risk, even if we are not among them. Standing together, we can help to protect the weak and marginalized in this time of crisis. It is our moral imperative to connect with and support one another. Doing so will be crucial to us moving forward as a stronger, kinder, and more resilient community. Thank you to all for joining us today and for being part of this moment of reflection and remembrance.
Hi, this is Congressman Seth Moulton. Today on Yom HaShoah, we honor and remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered during the Holocaust. Sadly, as we've seen in the last few months, veins of the hate that produced the Holocaust still run through our society. We've seen Asian Americans targeted by our former president. We've seen the Confederate flag carried by white supremacists through the People's House, our capital. We've seen cops killed by angry racist mobs, and we've seen signs of hate here at home in our own communities. We cannot turn away from this, so I want you to know that I'm joining you in the hard work of calling out hate, shining a light on injustice, and eliminating it. I am on your side, the side of what is good and what is righteous. The side that knows there are ideals universal in all of our faiths, that we have each other's backs, that we are brothers, that we are our brothers and our sisters' keeper. We have to take sides. As Elie Wiesel said, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Today, that means holding extremists accountable when they break the law. It also means reckoning with our own country's racist legacy. We have the power to ensure that everybody's humanity is recognized and appreciated, that everyone is treated justly under the law. Despite the images of white supremacist violence that have been playing out on our screens since January 6th, there is reason to be hopeful. All across the country, we're seeing people, young and old, take to the streets to stand up and speak out against injustice. Not to mention that just a couple of months before the Capitol riot, record numbers of people showed up across the country and rejected the racism coming out of the White House and willed our country forward into a new year. In that sense, I look at the Capitol riot not as the beginning of a new era, where fear and hate runs rampant, but at the end of a movement that knows it only wins through division. We need to keep forcing progress. Hate will not disappear simply by replacing our president. So on this important day, in a year where we have been forced to stand apart, let us recommit ourselves to taking the side of each other, to standing together for what is good and just, and standing against the wickedness we've seen in our news lately. Thank you, and all the best.
The Holocaust was not only a historical event in the past. The pain, suffering, and memory of victims and survivors continues through generations of individuals and families. Rachel Cerruti is part of the third generation Holocaust survivors. In her presentations, podcasts, and writings, she reflects on the Holocaust and the meanings across time and generations. Tonight, she joins us remotely to recount the story of her grandmother's survival of the Holocaust as she reads from her recently published book, We Share the Same Sky.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Cerruti, and I am a photographer, a writer, an educator, and an audio producer. But more importantly than any of those things, I am the granddaughter of a fierce woman whose name was Hannah Dubova, who was a Holocaust survivor. Back in 2009, almost 12 years ago now, I sat down with my grandmother to begin storytelling sessions with her. I was 20 years old and a discontent college student with one thing on my mind, and that was to be a photojournalist. Like many young storytellers are told, I was advised to pick a story and start a blog. So I chose my grandmother's story. I knew she was a survivor and the only one in her family alive at the end of the war. I knew that in her survival story, there was an epic escape across the Baltic Sea and that she was stuffed underneath herring as she fled from the Nazis. I knew that she moved from one country to another, being saved by strangers. But I wanted to understand it in a different way. I wanted to hear her memories as she would tell them to her granddaughter. So we began to talk. And in that last year of her life, we traveled together through her words from her childhood home in Prague, through Scandinavia, where she found refuge during the war, to her immigration to America in 1950, and her early years of navigating a new life in a new country that was an ocean away from anyone she knew or any of the languages she spoke. My grandmother was an incredible storyteller, and I am certain that had she been born in another era and that had her childhood not been robbed and her family not murdered in the Holocaust, perhaps she would have chosen the same profession as I have. She was a truly gifted writer. I think she would have loved to travel the world, meeting new people and eating new foods and documenting her experiences along the way. My grandmother had an appreciation for life and a curiosity for culture that far exceeded anybody else I've ever met. After she passed away, I became obsessed with her story. And 12 years later, her story has not only become the backbone to my professional life, but the narrator to my personal life as well. On this evening, where we remember and honor those who survived and those who didn't survive, I want to share with you a reading from my forthcoming memoir, which will be released this summer, titled We Share the Same Sky. On October 8th, Mutti passed away. Mutti was my grandmother, it's what we called her, it means mother in German. There were no tubes or sterile walls. There were no doctors dictating visiting hours or nurses checking her vitals. Hannah died at home, a place that she had fought so many times over to create for herself. Her body lay peacefully. It was the first time I touched a dead body, but I didn't cry. My memory is in black and white. I remember her skin being cold and soft. I took her hand and kissed it. Surrounding her were her pictures, her writings, and the delicate pages that proved her past. It was everything that I, unknowingly at the time, would come to wrap my world around. In the years after her death, I uncovered the most beautiful archive of her life. It wasn't a hidden archive or a secret one. It was just what she had left behind. It was everything she had told me, curated and edited. There were preserved albums and hundreds of photographs dating back to the 1920s. There were letters waiting to be translated, journals, diaries, deportation, and immigration papers. There were pieces of creative writing from various stages of her life, some marked up with line edits. The archive was seemingly endless. Every time I thought I had found the last box, I discovered another. There were repeated stories, some written at age 14 and others at age 80. There were anecdotes and memories that contradicted each other, bringing the question of memory into all of her stories. There were childhood report cards and souvenirs from her cross-country travels. There were confessions of love and secrets intended to stay private, and flashbacks never intended to be understood. She had written about being a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, and a cousin, a friend, a student, and a dedicated member of her youth group. She was a strong-willed teen, a refugee, and an orphan. She was a survivor and a victim, a wanderer and someone who dreamed of home. She was a hopeful immigrant and a forced emigrant. She was an urban dweller and a farmer. She was a pioneer and a storyteller. She was a Czech child, a stateless teen, and an American wife. She was a traveler, an explorer, a teacher, and a student. She spoke 6 languages. She was a divorcee to one and a reignited flame to another. And for other men, she was the one who got away. She was a bride, a mother, and a grandmother, a young person searching for her future, and an elderly person watching her grandchildren search for theirs. I became obsessed with this material, adopting it as my own and taking it with me when I moved back to Boston after graduating from college. My methods of preserving my grandmother's story would have appalled any professional archivist. There were documents and photographs that should have been handled in a clean environment and stored in boxes that were waterproof and fire resistant and let in no light. There were delicate, worn pieces of paper, and yet here I was, sitting on my bedroom floor, moving them from one pile to another and storing them in manila folders with little to no protection. I digitized and organized it all, plucking it from the past and placing it into my present. I learned my grandmother's handwriting. She used the same shaky cursive to caption her photographs as she did to write letters to friends, while titles were always written in block capitals. I scanned every photograph. I retyped every diary. Every word went from her fingertips to my own. I paid close attention to the names and places I found in the archive. These details were found on the backs of photographs, on official documents, within the pages of journals, and on stamped letters sent from one country to another. I listed the names chronologically and took note of how she had gotten from one place to another and which train station she had stopped at. When my grandmother started telling me her story, she said she had felt like she was going on a big adventure. That's what her archive felt like as well. I began buying books about World War II and the Holocaust. It is the most well-documented genocide from the side of the perpetrators and the victims. I learned the basic facts quickly. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland from the west. A few weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The persecution of the Jews started far before that. I taught myself about the roots of antisemitism and the rise of the Nazis. It felt like a puzzle. The history books helped me understand my grandmother's story, and my grandmother's story helped me understand the history books. During these early years of obsession, I shared an apartment in Boston with 2 friends. I was stringing my rent together by working various jobs, primarily through photography, international travel programs, and teaching. My future felt like it was on the edge of exciting, but not yet burdened. My roommates and I hung white lights around the living room and lit candles, listening to Bob Marley, Kendrick Lamar, and Rudimental. We played games, made friends with each other's friends, and went to concerts. It was that time in life when we were all making bold decisions for ourselves, but not the kind that had to do with kids and marriage. We were all just figuring it out. Barack Obama was president and change was happening. Life was moving and love was flowing. With each new photograph I scanned or diary entry I transcribed, I became more and more committed to my grandmother's story. It had been almost 4 years since Hannah had died, and I'd spent too many years buried in her story to not let it take me somewhere. So I decided I would literally follow in her footprints. I would live in every country she had lived in. I would travel the way she had. I would track down all the characters from her journals, all the names listed in her letters and documents. And most importantly, I would try to find the people who had saved her life. In her diary, my grandmother called the Holocaust an incomprehensible black page of history. I wanted to know what happens when you turn the page. As we commemorate Yom HaShoah, I see us collectively, all of us here tonight from all corners of the world, as an example of what happens when you turn the page after a generation experiences genocide. We remember and we retell our family stories to not only say never again, to what happened to European Jews during the Holocaust, but also to acknowledge that identity-based killing, whether it happens during a genocide or in our neighborhoods, still surrounds us. Persecution, discrimination, and racism are not only deeply embedded in our histories, but are part of our present. We retell the stories of our ancestors to remember our history and also to inspire action. Thank you for having me on this commemoration day. I hope it's a meaningful evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your story of generations with us. It's important. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Laura Yakush, Albert Abramson Associate Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University. Before her appointment in Brandeis in 2016, she taught at New York University, the University of Leipzig, Ben-Gurion University, the University of Haifa, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has won several prestigious awards and fellowships and is considered a leading scholar in the field of Holocaust studies. Professor Yakush's research and teaching focus on the multifaceted histories of European Jews before, during, and after the Holocaust from a comparative, transnational, and cross-disciplinary perspective. Her research and publications on the origins of Holocaust research immediately after liberation from Nazi rule are considered pioneering works in the field. The subject of her talk tonight is the legal redress Jewish thinkers and leaders sought in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Professor Yakush.
Good evening. I'm Laura Yakush. Before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Christopher Moriello, Dr. Regina Casulina, and Dr. Dan Eschert for their kind invitation to speak at this Yom HaShoah memorial event tonight. It's a great honor. My talk tonight is entitled Justice, Justice, You Shall Pursue, Jewish Visions of Justice After the Holocaust. After Nazi Germany's surrender to the 4 victorious allies in May 1945, the Soviet, American, British, and French occupiers put thousands of former Nazis on trial. Among the hundreds of trials of both prominent Nazi leaders as well as grassroots-level perpetrators, the Nuremberg trial is no doubt the most iconic. Held by a four-power military tribunal 75 years ago in Nuremberg, the city where the Nazi Party had staged its monumental rallies, the International Military Tribunal tried 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders who were still alive and in Allied hands. The defendants included Reich Marshal and Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring, Hitler's temporary deputy Rudolf Hess, and Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The 11-month trial, which began on November 20th, 1945, ended in 12 death sentences, 7 prison terms, and 3 acquittals. The story of post-war justice is usually told as a triumph over tyranny. For the first time in world history, were heads of states held accountable for crimes against enemy nationals as well as their own citizens. An all-time warning to dictators and perpetrators of war and genocide. Yet, have you ever wondered what Holocaust survivors at the time thought about the Nuremberg trial? Did they think this was the trial of the century? Did Jewish victims have a role in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals? And were Jewish observers at the time satisfied with how the Allies handled post-Holocaust justice? During the war, Jews who were trapped in Nazi-occupied Europe, suffering the destruction of their families and communities and anticipating their own deaths, nevertheless held on to the belief that the day of judgment would eventually come for the perpetrators. In letters, diaries, last wills, they expressed their wish that the atrocities they endured would not go unpunished. For example, writing in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, Jewish diarist Stanisław Schnappmann expressed his desire to see Soviets, British, and Americans defeat Germany and, quote, Free the world from this horrible monster. Hope is beginning to stir in our hearts. Perhaps we will live to see the miracle after all. We want to live to see a triumph over darkness, justice over tyranny, and freedom over oppression and terror. We yearn to live to build a better world. But will we make it? Is it not too late? End quote. For Schnappmann, it was too late, and he did not survive. While Jews under Nazi rule recorded the atrocities they witnessed in diaries, letters, and underground archives, Jews in the free world prepared evidence for future trials. In 1942, the World Jewish Congress, an international organization representing Jewish communities in dozens of countries, began to gather evidence, and, staffed with numerous refugee lawyers, it thought about legal arguments for future trials. The World Jewish Congress also tried to get a seat on the United Nations War Crimes Commission to act as a representative of European Jewry. It was rejected because the War Crimes Commission did not admit non-state actors, and researching crimes against Jews was not a priority. After Nazi Germany's defeat, the World Jewish Congress lobbied US Chief Justice Robert H. Jackson to be given an official function at the Nuremberg trial as a representative of the Jewish victims and survivors. But Jackson wouldn't hear of it. Only states could have an official affiliation with the tribunal, and Jackson feared that other victim groups would make similar demands. As a result, Jews only played a marginal role at the Nuremberg trial. Although the tribunal used 240 witnesses, it only admitted 3 Jewish survivors, all of whom testified for the Soviet prosecution. One of them was the poet and partisan Avram Sutzkever, a survivor of the Vilna ghetto. Sutzkever's testimony in February 1946 described how the Germans had murdered his baby boy in the Jewish hospital in the Vilna ghetto and detailed the mass shootings of 45,000 Jews at Ponary. Before taking the witness stand, Sutzkever noted in his diary, and I quote, "I feel a tremendous responsibility toward the dead, and I pray that their souls will lament for my words. I want to speak in Yiddish, in the language of the nation whom the men in the dock tried to extinguish. Our mother tongue must be heard. It shall triumph at Nuremberg as a symbol of our immortality." End quote. Yet the Soviets did not allow Sutzkever to testify in Yiddish and forced him to speak Russian instead. Not only was expressing his traumatic experiences in a foreign language more difficult for him, but it also meant that the language of the majority of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust did not sound in the courtroom. Why couldn't the tribunal, with its 5 official languages and its army of interpreters, translate a testimony in Yiddish? And why were there so few Holocaust survivors among the witnesses? Contrary to the widespread misconception today, the Nuremberg trial was not a Holocaust trial. The primary focus was not on the Nazi extermination of 2/3 of European Jews, but rather on crimes against humanity and war crimes more broadly. Moreover, the Nuremberg trial took place in a legal culture that favored documents over witness testimony. First and foremost, the Allied prosecutors tried to prove the defendants guilty by means of their own documents and through the accounts of other lower-ranking Nazi officials, rather than individual victims. Each of the 4 Allied powers also had their political reasons for not granting Jews center stage at the trial. With antisemitism on the rise at home, the Americans sought to avoid the impression that they were holding a quote-unquote vengeance trial on behalf of the Jews. And moreover, they downplayed the racial nature of Nazi crimes in order to forestall efforts by the German defense councils to use racial segregation in the US to their own advantage. The British, for their part, sought to avoid arguments that the victimization of Jews by the Nazi regime validated Jewish claims for statehood in British Mandatory Palestine. The French also downplayed the racial aspect of Nazi persecution, focusing instead on victims of political persecution, allowed them to highlight French anti-Nazi resistance while avoiding the painful topic of Vichy's participation in the racial persecution of Jews in France. The Soviets, for their part, only considered the suffering of Jews as long as it could be used to illustrate the victimization of Soviet citizens and serve to emphasize the narrative of heroic anti-fascist fight and patriotic war. Although Jewish actors did not play a role in the limelight of the courtroom, they nevertheless made an impact on the Nuremberg trial. The World Jewish Congress commented on the indictment, supplied statistics on Jewish losses, and gave legal advice. Jews served as investigators, translators, secretaries, photographers, journalists, psychiatrists, and lawyers. Two of the 12 American successor trials had Jewish prosecutors. The German Jewish refugee lawyer Robert Kempner, who led the case against the German Foreign Office, and Benjamin Ferenc, a Romanian-born Jewish lawyer who was only 27 years young when he served as chief prosecutor against 24 high-ranking SS officers who had been responsible for murdering 1.5 million Soviet Jews in mass shootings. Although Jewish witnesses were marginal at Nuremberg, they played prominent roles in many other Allied trials, mainly in concentration camp trials. Since these focused on lower-level perpetrators such as camp commandants and SS guards, not on Nazi leaders as the Nuremberg trial, the incriminating accounts of individual victims could be directly linked to the defendants. This was the case, for example, in the British Belsen trial of camp personnel of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen, among them camp commandant Josef Kramer and the notorious female SS camp guard Irma Grese. The trial took place between September and November 1945 in Lüneburg, Germany, and Jews constituted the majority of the prosecution witnesses. One of these witnesses was the then 20-year-old cellist Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who had survived Auschwitz because she was drafted into the camp orchestra and was later transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated by the British. Appearing as a trial witness was deeply meaningful for her. But she was also frustrated because the British seemed completely unaware of the hell that she had gone through. In retrospect, she remarked that taking the stand at the Belsen trial had made her realize, and I quote her, how impossible it was for the outside world to understand what was going on here. It was a proper trial, British justice, innocent until proven guilty. And I was exposed to the most ridiculous questions. I would be asked questions like, did you ever see anyone kill anybody? And I would say, yes. And I would be asked, what day was it? And I would say, I don't know. What time was it? What was it, a stick? Was it a stone? I could not answer these questions. Because A, I didn't have a watch, and B, I couldn't care less what date it was. And you are under oath. And I was a very good girl. Of course, I didn't invent anything. But you immediately feel like a liar, end quote. Other survivors echoed Lasker-Wallfisch's feelings. And yet, many post-war trials, including those held in German courts and other national courts, would not have happened at all if it had not been for the many Jewish survivors who identified perpetrators and brought charges and incriminating evidence against them. For example, in 1949, two young Polish Jews who had survived the Sobibor death camp, Esther Arab and Samuel Lehrer, accidentally spotted Erich Bauer in the streets of Berlin. As a so-called gas master, Bauer had personally been responsible for the death of over 200,000 Jews at Sobibor. He had been in an American POW camp after the war, but had been released. And it was only thanks to Raab and Lehrer that he was tried in West Berlin in 1950. He first received the death sentence, which was soon commuted to life when Germany abolished capital punishment. Raab and Lehrer also served as witnesses in the later West German Sobibor trials in the mid-1960s. And in addition, indefatigable Nazi hunters, as for example Simon Wiesenthal and Tuvia Friedman, were instrumental in tracking down dozens of Nazi perpetrators, among them Adolf Eichmann, and bringing them to trial. But were survivors satisfied with courtroom justice? Judged by newspaper coverage, memoirs, and testimony, the answer is not quite. The coverage of the Nuremberg trial in the Jewish press reveals that the 250,000 survivors who temporarily lived in the Western zone of occupation in Germany as Jewish displaced persons had high expectations that the Allies would build a new moral order and teach humankind a lesson to prevent future genocides. Yet, few weeks into the trial, it became clear that these expectations would be disappointed. Many Jews felt that their suffering was marginalized at the trial. They understood the Holocaust as a crime sui generis that needed to be treated as a unit and could not be broken up and subsumed under various other Nazi crimes. Survivors felt that the Allied prosecutors and judges simply didn't understand the magnitude and distinct nature of the Nazi final solution. For example, the Polish Jewish journalist Szapce Klugman, who was among the 600 journalists from around the world who followed the Nuremberg trial inside the courtroom, reported for the Yiddish press, and I quote Klugman, "The Allies simply do not know what the no return from Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz actually felt like. They will never smell the crematoria ovens, and the worst thing is, they do not even want to know." End quote. Klugman was frustrated with the Soviets who brought in Jewish witnesses like Sutzkever, but downplayed that Jews were murdered at Ponary, Birkenau, and Treblinka for the sole reason of their Jewish background. Klugman complained, quote, "Those who bring no knowledge from home will think that Soviet children were thrown into the fire, Soviet women were hanged. Yes, it's ironic. All of a sudden, we are equal. Tragic is our fate. Our haters murder us because we are Jews, and our good friends are so ashamed of us that they barely have the courage to place an anonymous gravestone for us." End quote. On a different occasion, Klugman remarked in despair, and I quote him, "The only suitable behavior in this courtroom would be to wear sack and ashes, sit down on the floor, say laments over the devastation and lowliness of humankind. One sits in the courtroom, drunken with blood and tears, oversaturated with pain and agony, and every pore of one's soul cries for justice. Justice, not vengeance." End quote. Yet justice remained aspirational at best. By the end of the 1940s, survivors became increasingly frustrated because the Allied war crime trial program came to an end, and the political interest of winning West Germany as an ally in the Cold War led to countless amnesties. In the following decades, German court cases related to Nazi war crimes were deeply flawed by a legal system that never really cleaned house, and prosecutors and judges who were deeply sympathetic to the perpetrators. While Germany investigated over 100,000 individuals in 7 decades, it only brought to trial 13,000 and convicted 6,000, and most perpetrators got away with minimizing their intent and blaming their superiors. Overall, however, survivors were gratified to see the perpetrators tried and punished. But they also agonized over the fact that given the sheer magnitude of the Holocaust, no punishment could possibly befit the crime itself. For example, Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who testified at the Belsen trial, admitted that, quote, "The whole trial seemed like a total and utter farce to me, because you cannot apply British justice, which is a very commendable thing, to something that is so outside anything that has ever been. Admittedly, most of the people were sentenced to death, but the whole system suddenly made me realize this is stuff that will never be really understood unless you have been in it," end quote. Asked if she thought that trials were still the right response, she replied, "Yes, what else can you do?" The Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt captured this sentiment when she wrote in 1945, and I quote Arendt, "It is senseless to hang a man for murder who took part in the fabrication of corpses, although, of course, we hardly have any other cause of action. These were crimes which no punishment seems to fit because all punishment is limited to the death penalty," end quote. That is to say, post-Holocaust justice has no redemptive narrative. Too few perpetrators have been brought to trial and their punishment did not befit the crime. But it would have been a crime in and of itself if those trials, with all their flaws and faults, had not happened at all. The Nuremberg trial set the stage for the International Criminal Court and its cases of perpetrators of mass atrocity in Bosnia, Rwanda, and elsewhere. Over the years, mass atrocity trials have become more victim-focused, and victims can become parties to the case in addition to taking the witness stand, as for example, in the Khmer Rouge trial in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, or the recent German trials of John Demjanjuk and a number of Auschwitz camp guards. Overall, trials were crucial in bringing Nazi crimes to public consciousness, and the records they created are essential for Holocaust research and education. We must do justice and credit the many Jewish actors, and especially Holocaust survivors, whose relentless pursuit of justice, even if justice is incomplete, made the process of reckoning possible at all. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. At this time, we will now chant the El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer in memory of our departed. As I chant these words, we take a deep breath and we remember their souls as they are among us at this time. Malei Rachamim, Shochei B'Amramim, Hamatzai Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechinah, B'malot Kedoshim Utahorim Kizahar Harakia Masiri Nishmot Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael Shenitbechu נשים בטוב, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנחרבו, שמרסו את נפשם על קידוש השם. מנוחתם הנבל הרחמים, הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים. וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו, ושלום 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 המשפטיהם, ונאמר Amen. El Malay Rachamim, exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure. To the souls of our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their neshamot, may their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they forever rest in peace. And we say, Amen.
We continue with the singing of Hatikva.
As we close tonight, I want to thank everyone who joined us virtually for this event. Your presence, while virtual, reflects your commitment not only to the memory of Holocaust victims and survivors, but to our common mission of combating antisemitism, racism, and prejudice in our communities, nation, and world. I would like to thank all our presenters and performers who made tonight so special. I would particularly like to thank Rabbis David Meyer and Rabbi Richard Perlman, and the staff at Temple Emmanuel. A production like this depends on the work of many dedicated people behind the scenes. The staff of the ITS department and the web communications at Salem State University, the hardworking team at Preston Productions who directed and produced this event, the Office of Institutional Advancement at Salem State University, the staff of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Graduate Assistant Aino Aktenin, Program Assistant Regina Kazayulina, and Program Director Dan Eschett. And finally, we thank our sponsors for the event, the contributors to our online tribute book, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and the Cummings Foundation. For all our events, sign up for our mailing list or visit our website at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. This event has been recorded, and once we edit the closed captioning, it will be available to share on our webpage. Once again, thank you for joining us tonight. Be well, and good evening.